Parents are always role models for their children, especially those in the toddler and preschool years, who are like a blank slate, not yet shaped by the outside world. At this age, children usually learn to communicate with others, manage their emotions, and solve problems by observing and imitating their parents' behavior. For example, if parents are consistently gentle and patient with others in everyday life, the children will mirror that behavior in their own interactions. On the other hand, if parents are frequently irritable or impatient, the children may be more prone to emotional outbursts when dealing with problems. While it's true that a great number of serial killers suffered through abusive, torturous, and neglected childhoods, the majority of abused children do not become offenders. So what has pushed a person into a criminal life? What shapes the criminal mind? On December 8, 1991, 31-year-old Debbie told her roommate that she was going to get a little change. And then, she mysteriously disappeared into the Woodward Corridor. 6 days later, a homeless man trying to take shelter from the cold inside an abandoned house pushed open the broken door and saw Debbie lying half naked on the floor, with the strangulation marks on her neck extremely obvious. But the Detroit police didn't think much of it because, in those days, prostitutes and drug addicts, even in death, would not attract anyone's attention. However, just half a month later, the scene of 26-year-old Mason's death was also discovered. On December 11th, Mason went out of the door wrapped in a thin jacket, saying that she had to go to the grocery store to buy a few things, and as a result, she never returned to the apartment. On the third day of the new year, on January 3rd, 1992, a demolition crew wielded hammers and smashed down the wall of an abandoned house. Then the half-naked body of 36-year-old Patricia, who had been on the police wanted list for drugs since December, lay there quietly. At the time, no one expected that Patricia's death was not due to drugs, but to a targeted serial murder of drug addicts and prostitutes. On January 25th, 39-year-old Vicky was found dead, and like the previous victims, she had been sexually assaulted and strangled by her killer. Meanwhile, a black man was arrested by the police in an abandoned house. Benjamin Atkins, 24 years old, without a permanent residence, as well as a regular job, with a history of drug abuse and carrying fresh scratches on his body. The interrogation lasted more than 10 hours, and in the end, due to the lack of evidence, Atkins was released. When he left the police station with a big stride, he left behind the words, "You're going to regret this." On February 17th, a foul odor led police to the Monterey Hotel, located opposite Highland Park. Upon arrival, they discovered the remains of 3 women in 3 rooms within a 10-meter radius. The victims were identified as 34-year-old Valerie and 23-year-old Juanita, and a young woman with no identifying markers. All 3 women were prostitutes and drug addicts, and were sexually assaulted and strangled. Despite a breakthrough in 2024, when the 3rd victim was finally identified through genetic genealogy, her name remains a secret. At her family's request, it was permanently withheld from the public. And the woman is forever memorialized in the case files only as Jane Doe. On April 5th, 38-year-old Brenda was led out the door by her children, saying they wanted to go to get bread from the grocery store. However, 4 days later, her 2 children stood in the shelter asking where their mother had gone. Brenda was lying in an abandoned house almost naked, with only a scarf still wrapped tightly around her neck. At first, the forensic doctor thought it was just a sad drug overdose, until the strangulation marks on her neck proved it all. Just 6 short days later, 43-year-old Brown's body was found. On March 25th, she had told her colleagues that she was going to see an old friend. When her body was found, it was so rotten that it was almost unrecognizable. On June 15th, the last known and linked victim was called Joanne. Like the previous victims, Joanne was similarly sexually assaulted as well as strangled. On the morning of August 21st, 1992, Detroit was under a light rain. Atkins, who still reeked of alcohol, was escorted to an interrogation room. He had been arrested after one of his rape victims, a 34-year-old woman named Darlene, spotted him on the street and called the police. In October last year, it was Atkins who dragged her into an abandoned house. He strangled her neck with shoelaces and sexually assaulted her. Fortunately, Darlene was saved with the help of passers-by. Faced with the rape accusation, Atkins said, "I'm gay, and I have no interest in women." The police officers did not refute this statement. They just handed Atkins some information about the previous serial murders, including the location of the victims and the psychological profile of the murderer. Then, a police officer said, "We will give you 12 hours, and then the prosecutor will prosecute you." Later, Atkins admitted the crime, saying that he was the Woodward Corridor Killer. He said that, in reality, the first victim to die was Patricia, not Debbie. Back in the autumn of 1991, Patricia hid in an abandoned house after being seized by the police in the drug den, and then Atkins knocked on the door of her house with a bag of cheap beer and drugs. Half an hour later, Atkins took out his shoelaces and strangled Patricia's neck, like tying an old coat, tightening them tighter and tighter, and then everything became quiet. Later, Atkins added, "I hate prostitutes because they make me think of my mother." The next victims were Debbie, Mason, and Vicky. Atkins remembered the color of everyone's coat, the length of their hair, and the last plea before their death. He said that only two things were needed to trick those prostitutes into the house: drugs and promises. Later, the police officers interrupted Atkins' speech. They said that the remains of Osanina and Smith had not been found yet. Hearing these words, Atkins smiled. On the same day, the police found the remains of Osanina and Smith based on Atkins' identification. In the end, Atkins said, "I hated them and myself. Every time I strangled a victim, I told myself that there was one less person like my mother in the world. And then, due to the lack of evidence, the prosecution could only prosecute Atkins with the testimony of Darlene and Atkins himself." In January 1994, the trial began. More than 150 witnesses stood together to watch Atkins' trial, including the victims' mothers, children, brothers, and sisters. At the hearing, Atkins admitted to the murder but claimed to be insane. His attorney also tried to exonerate him of his crimes, saying Atkins was not a monster but a child raised by monsters. The crimes were caused by Atkins' childhood abuse, trauma, and drug addiction, which led him to start murdering other people. Detroit, located on the banks of the Detroit River in Michigan and across the river from Windsor, Canada, was once known as the automobile capital of the world, and also one of the major birthplaces of American music. However, a large-scale race riot led to the city's gradual decline. In the early morning hours of July 23, 1967, the Detroit police made a surprise raid on an unlicensed bar at 12th Street and Claremont Street, violently arresting dozens of black patrons. However, this action triggered strong resentment in the black community, turning a police raid into a large-scale racial conflict between the two races. And the entire Detroit area was plunged into chaos over a period of 5 days, resulting in at least 43 deaths and more than 2,000 injuries. In the aftermath, white residents living in Detroit moved to nearby suburbs for fear of racial retaliation by blacks. In the end, order collapsed and Detroit's economy declined. A year later, on August 26, 1968, Atkins came into the world. As the youngest child in his family, he had the most difficult fate. His parents were both drug addicts and alcoholics. Before Atkins could learn to walk, his father abandoned the family, leaving his wife and children. Sometime in 1970, his mother chose to leave as well. She took Atkins' older brother with her and left only Atkins on the doorstep of the orphanage like a bag of old clothes. Atkins was orphaned that year, when he was only 2 years old and could not yet speak in complete sentences. In those days, the orphanage was not a sanctuary, but a purgatory. Its walls turned into borders that confined Atkins, where his world had no fairy tales, only harsh realities. Throughout his childhood, other children would abuse and beat Atkins simply because he was the weakest. At the age of 10, an employee who was supposed to be a child protector left Atkins with unhealing trauma. He dragged Atkins in the basement and sexually assaulted him. After that day, Atkins finally understood that living could be an extremely long, lingering death. For the next 5 years, the sexual assaults were like a nightmare, repeatedly hurting him, until he mustered up the courage to escape from that pain-filled orphanage. After escaping, Atkins, covered in bruises and exhaustion, returned to his mother's side. During that time, Atkins lived with his brother and his mother. However, Atkins soon found out that his mother had become a prostitute to make a living. This brutal truth shattered Atkins' fantasies about his mother like a sharp blade. More than once, he witnessed his mother having sex with strange men in the house, watched as his mother lay underneath the strange men, and listened to her moans coming from next door. Realizing that the home was almost indistinguishable from an orphanage, Atkins' heart felt an extreme disgust for his mother's behavior. In the late 1980s, Atkins left home not to run away this time, but to break free. He lived on the streets, slept on park benches, and, having inherited the drug addiction gene from his parents, eventually became addicted to drugs as well. But misery never spares the poor. Because of the lack of formal education, Atkins could only take those dirty jobs at a very bad price. Due to the inability to make ends meet and pay the rent of his apartment, every night Atkins could only go to the homeless shelter to spend the night. People who knew him always said that Atkins was actually a gentle person. When he was sober, his humor would make everyone like him, but when Atkins drank or took drugs, he would show antisocial personality behavior. His eyes would become vacant. He would say vicious things, curse women, his mother, and himself, saying, "Women are liars and bitches." Born into this kind of family and living in this kind of environment, Atkins has no future and will not have a future. Gradually, he became a serial killer, like the Green River Killer, killing the women they thought were harmful to society. The 4-month trial was like a long autopsy. One day, the jury finally ruled that Atkins was guilty and sentenced him to multiple life imprisonments. Later, after his conviction, Atkins was first transported to the Charles Egler Reception and Orientation Center in Jackson. However, a medical examination revealed that Atkins was suffering from a serious medical condition. In early 1995, Atkins was transferred to Duane Waters Hospital, where he died 2 years later, on September 17, 1997, of an AIDS-related illness.